Today I'm going to start working on a pretty simple form of padlock. I'm not sure exactly where this design originated, but it's certainly been around in one form or another since the late 1700s. It's a great blacksmith project because you don't need to follow any drawings or patterns. You just start with one piece and then start measuring the next piece off of that one and then keep working around until you have the lock. I'm going to be designing this lock around the shackle. It's the only part of the lock that needs to be forged, so I'm just going to get that out of the way first, and I'll just freeform it, make it look about the right size, and then I'll design the rest of the lock around that. I'm going to be using a 3/8 inch mild steel round bar for the shackle, and in this heat I've just flattened out the end that's going to be curved around to make the hinge for the shackle. And in this heat I'll be wrapping that flat section around the pin that I'm going to be using as the hinge pin. You can punch a hole at the end of the bar to create this detail if you want, but a lot of the older locks that I've seen, this was usually just flattened out and wrapped around like I'm doing here. I'm not trying to make this a high security lock, so a wrapped hinge barrel is just fine. And of course the final step is to wrap it around into the shackle shape. Again, this doesn't need to conform to anything. It's the first part of the lock and everything else is going to be measured to it. And here it is cut from the bar. I've left the end a little bit long and I haven't tried to figure out where I need to put the hole for the locking mechanism yet. I'll be figuring all that out later. But it will be a detail that will be ground in and cut cold, not forged hot. The next thing that I'm going to be working on is to rough out the bar stock that I'm going to need to make these rivets. I'm going to need 3 or 4 of these, and they get riveted to the side plate, which wraps around the entire lock, and then once it's riveted to the side plate, it's used to fasten the top and the bottom plate to the side plate. And this was a pretty standard way of assembling lock parts, and it was used for several hundred years. So when you're looking at old locks and you see these rivets on the side that don't seem to make any sense, you'll notice that they do line up with the rivet on the top and the bottom plate. And they're just holding the frame of the lock together. It doesn't have anything to do with the mechanism. Now the problem with making these, especially with a padlock, is that they are extremely small. So the best way to approach this is not to make individual rivets. Mill out all the side pins out of a larger bar and then cut the profile of the hinge out of that bar. And then when you're ready to actually assemble the lock, that's when you cut the individual rivets from that section and fit them to the lock. So here I have the bar that I'm going to be using for these rivets, and what's sticking up out of the vise jaws is the length that I need for the side pins. Actually, it's a lot longer than I need for the side pins, but it's better to trim it down than to try to figure out where to get extra material later. And then I'm going to use a hacksaw to cut out a number of pins along the length of that bar. So what I'm doing is I'm leaving a space at the end of the bar, and then I'm making 2 hacksaw cuts to define the pin that's actually going to be the rivet for the side plate. Now the rivet is square, so the width or the space between the 2 saw cuts is the same as the thickness of the bar. And then I'm moving over a lot, more than enough distance that I need, and then I'm going to make another square pin, and then I'm moving over again quite a distance, and then I'm making another pin, and so on for however many pins that I need. The next thing that I'm going to be doing is taking a chisel and marking the areas that need to come out, because next I'm going to be adding more saw cuts to this piece, and if these sections are not clearly defined, all of these saw cuts are going to look the same, and you're going to really be confused about which areas need to come out and which areas are the pins. So once I have all that clearly marked, I'm just going to be adding more saw cuts to make removing that section easier. And then it's just a simple matter of using a cold chisel to break everything away in between the pins. I've moved the piece to the center of the vise because I've noticed that the vise jaws on this vise are a little bit distorted, so if I'm clamping onto a wide piece, they really don't grab that securely at the ends. So I'm moving the cut to the center so that I can have a firm grip on the piece and it'll shear off very cleanly. So here's the piece roughed out with the side pins sticking out the side, and I have lots of space in between these pins to form the rivets that I'm going to need for the top and bottom plates. Next I'll be cutting this from the bar and then eventually separating off all the individual rivets. And while it's still on the bar, I'm just going to clean up the edge that's going to be sitting up against the side plate. So now I'm getting ready to figure out the rest of the lock. I have the shackle on a piece of paper and I'm just roughly tracing out the outline. And then once I have that traced out, I'm going to establish roughly a center line and then create a half pattern of the front and back plate. And once I have that, I'm going to fold it along the center line and use the area that I already have traced to trace out the other side of the lock, and then I'll have the completed pattern. And here I have two pattern pieces glued to a plate and it's ready to cut out. I'm going to be using 14 gauge for the front and back plates and the side plate of this lock. To speed things along, I decided to cut out this project on my cut-off saw. The edges of these locks were always filed very smooth and square, so chiseling this profile out would just create a lot of extra work trying to clean up all those chisel cuts. And while I was at it, I cut the rivet blank from the main bar and I cut a long strip of flat stock that I'm going to be using for the side plate of the lock. And the final thing I'm going to be doing today is a little bit of cleanup to get all the edges trued up and ready for assembly. I have the front and the back plate clamped together and I'm going to be filing both pieces at the same time. So when I move them in the vise, I always grab them with a pair of vise grips to make sure that they don't shift out of position while I'm moving them around. It just makes things a lot easier. That way I don't have to worry about realigning everything. I always check to make sure that nothing has moved, but the vise grips usually do a pretty good job of holding everything in place. I also need to be truing up that long strip that I'm going to use for the side plate on the lock. So here I have it clamped into a large saw vise that I have. And I'm going to be using that as a straight edge to file to make sure that the piece is straight. I'm not going after a real machine shop precision here. All I'm trying to do is file out any dips or bumps that'll make it obvious that the two plates aren't fitting well together. I'm just using this clamp because I have it. If I didn't, I would just take a couple of bars and clamped a strip between the vise and some C-clamps. So here's what I have so far, and next week we'll start putting this all together. Hi, I'm Dennis, and thanks for watching. As most of you know, for the past few years I've been producing YouTube videos on a part-time basis. I am now looking to turn that hobby into a full-time job, and for that I really need your help. A small monthly contribution from a really small number of viewers will generate the income that I need to achieve that goal. So if you're interested in the work that I'm doing and you want to lend your support, please click on the Patreon icon at the bottom of the screen. Thank you. We'll see you next time.